Hello friends, welcome to exam quiz. In this video we will be doing sources of Indian constitution. These are very much important because it is asked in every competitive exams. So without any delay, let's begin this quiz. The idea of the rule of law in the Indian constitution is taken from which country? Parliamentary system in India is borrowed from which country constitution? Fundamental rights are borrowed from the which country constitution? Judicial review in India is inspired from which country constitution? The preamble of India is influenced by which country constitution? Directive principles of state policy are borrowed from which country constitution? Concurrent list is inspired from constitution of which country? The concept of single citizenship is borrowed from which country constitution? Federation with a strong center is taken from which country constitution? The idea of fundamental duties is borrowed from which country constitution? Suspension of fundamental rights during emergency is inspired from which country constitution? Procedure established by law comes from which country constitution? Impeachment of the president is borrowed from which country constitution? The cabinet system is taken from which country constitution? Independence of judiciary is borrowed from which country constitution? Bicameralism in India is inspired from which country constitution? The concept of office of the vice president is borrowed from which country constitution? Emergency provisions are mostly inspired from which country constitution? Ideas of justice in preamble are borrowed from which country? The concept of liberty, equality, fraternity comes from which country constitution? Method of constitutional amendments comes from which country constitution? The principle of popular sovereignty is derived from which country constitution? The system of nomination to Rajya Sabha is borrowed from which country constitution? The idea of cabinet responsibility comes from which country constitution? Financial emergency is inspired from which country constitution in Indian constitution? The idea of residual powers with the center is taken from? The concept of writs is borrowed from which country constitution? The concept of judicial activism traces influence from which country constitution? The idea of republic is borrowed from which country constitution? Election Commission is inspired from which country? The concept of sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic is inspired from which country constitution? The concept of quasi-federalism is similar to which country? The idea of constitutional remedies Article 32 is inspired from which country constitution? Concept of equal protection of laws is borrowed from which country? The concept of presidential veto is inspired from which country constitution? The concurrent list under the Indian constitution is borrowed from which country constitution? The concept of bicameral legislature is borrowed from which country constitution? Union Public Service Commission is influenced by which country constitution? The office of the Comptroller and Auditor General is borrowed from which country constitution? The concept of Speaker of Lok Sabha is borrowed from which country constitution? The idea of public interest litigation is borrowed from which country constitution? The concept of preamble being amendable is taken from which country? Distribution of powers union, state and concurrent list is inspired by which country constitution? Freedom of trade and commerce is taken from which country? The idea of a written constitution is inspired by which country? Parliamentary privilege in India is influenced by which country? The concept of removal of judges is inspired by which country? The concept of federal system with a strong union comes from which country constitution? The system of Panchayati Raj is influenced by which country? The concept of the rule of interpretation of the constitution comes from which country? The concept of the 5-year plan is inspired by which country constitution? Appointment of governor is influenced by which country constitution? The concept of non-confidence motion is taken from? Administrative relations between center and states is influenced by which country? The concept of separation of powers between center and states is borrowed from which country constitution? The idea of independent election machinery comes from which country constitution? The concept of propagation of parliament comes from which country? Fundamental rights, right to property, originally fundamental rights, was inspired by which country constitution? The Government of India Act 1935 influence is seen mostly in which type of government? From how many countries has the Constitution of India borrowed its features? Friends, if you know this answer, comment below. So friends, these were the most expected questions could be asked in competitive exams like SSC, UPSC and state competitive exams. And guys, if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more videos. Thank you all.